Welcome to this month's Neuroprosthesis Seminar, sponsored by the FES Center. The APT Center is hosting Dustin Tyler today, but before we get started, I want to remind everybody that next month's seminar is on the 16th, Friday the 16th of May, and the speaker will be Mark Tazinski from UCSD Center for Neural Repair, and that's being jointly sponsored by the Department of Neuroscience and the Neurological Institute at UH. So mark your calendars for next month, too. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dustin Tyler, who should be vulgarly familiar to most of you. Dustin's been a case on faculty since 2003. Did his graduate work here after coming from Michigan Technical University. Graduated in '99, went to work in industry, couldn't stay away, came back and joined the faculty, and has been doing some really pioneering work in neural interfacing, neural engineering, basic work as well as applied work in dysphagia, and, as you'll hear today, sensation for amputees. So please give Dustin your attention. You may want to fill up on coffee now before he gets started. But Dustin told me his talk is broken up into two parts, so there'll be a time for question and answers and in between during the intermission. So, Dustin.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Ron. Yeah, talk in two parts. Thank you all for coming this morning. And what I want to talk about today, we all have five senses. We have this traditional thing we learn early on. You know, I have vision, I have auditory, I have olfactory. These are things that sort of sense the world around us, usually from a distance. You know, so when I can see what's around me and away from me. I can hear things that are happening. I can smell the environment, right? And I pick up chemical cues that way. Taste, local, you know, it's stuff I usually put in me or near me, but it's in the mouth, kind of a localized. And my fifth sense is what I want to talk about today is touch. It's the biggest organ we have, ultimately, with the skin. It's all over, it's distributed, and it's our way really of interacting with the world. When you have a child, when you have a relationship, when you have anything like that, it's the touch that brings it real, not an entity outside of yourself. And when you lose that, such as an amputation, you lose that connection in going through, you know, to people. And so ultimately, in most cases, the prosthesis without sensation is basically a tool at the end of the residual limb. And so what we've been working to do is restore that sense of touch to people that have lost their arm. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. So as a background to get started, actually it's not the background, but if you do fall asleep and haven't had your coffee, these are the four things that I kind of want you to remember, right? So if you don't remember anything else, just remember basically that what we've been able to generate is a stable, chronic interface for sensory restoration. So we now have patients I'm going to talk about in a trial that's going on that have been implanted for almost 2 years as of May for one of them and well over a year for our second without a change in terms of their response and what's going on. We can generate on the perceptual hand, right, restore sensation in localized areas, and we can also produce multiple qualities of sensation, so different things that they can feel in each one of these places. That's revolutionary ultimately in what's going on in the field. Sensation has both functional and psychological benefit to the person that gets the sensation. And that, so Dominique Durand was going to be part of this and, as well, but he's unfortunately been waylaid by travel. But I want to talk about or present for him. This is his work. But we also, the same basic interface has a potential viable command. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but I want to introduce that work that we've been doing. So those are the four things that I want to get across today. It is in two parts. The first part is, you know, be broadcast, but the second I want to talk locally about. We have some stuff in review, so I don't want to broadcast, but we'll talk about. That's why there's a talk in two parts. All right. So again, while you're awake, the most important thing is I'm a ringleader. I'm not a doer most of the time. These are the critical people. Dan Tan, who is someday going to finish his PhD. He thinks hopefully soon. Has really been. You know, as all of us know in clinical work, the patients to go from an idea to actually getting trials is often very long. And so we spent a lot of time in development, but has now been basically the lead with Matt Schieffer, who's been postdoc in the lab. These have been the two kind of lead guys and slogged through the whole thing along the way to get this going and are basically the the ones that have produced most of these results. Michael Keith and Robert Anderson are the surgeons. They've been invaluable in this. Emily Graychick's actually taking over for Dan, ultimately, and continuing this project. And probably the most important person on the list that keeps us all running is Melissa Schmidt, who basically keeps me out of trouble and keeps our patients coming in, and you name it. So she's fantastic. And then occupational therapist who works with this, Joyce, and then a couple undergraduates in the regulatory. So these people are really important to get it going, and so what I present is basically the work that they're doing. So let me start with we always starts the introduction. That's not usually the way you start the slide. So sorry, the picture was there, but it's brought up. I mean, essentially, you can say they're responsible or not, but the reality is, war brings difference to prosthetics. It is a small market, right? And usually, the Second World War brought a lot of the lower limb amputees. You have, at least from the Olympic side, the Blade Runner, and forget what's going on now. People that can basically run and do fantastic things with lower limb prosthetics that made advances in the World War II era. Now, because of the Operation Enduring Freedom and these things that have happened, there became another intense focus on the upper extremity. So people coming back from the Middle East with limb loss, that became sort of a rallying cry, something that people say we could make a difference on. And they said, look, hands have been basic prostheses forever. They need investment, and they haven't had it, and our returning servicemen deserve this, so they made investments in this. Now, the reality is the number of people coming back from the Middle East without limbs is traumatic or tragic, and it's often multiple limbs, such as this. I mean, this is unbelievable, really, what these people do. But it's about 1,600 individuals, 16 to 1,700, depending on the latest numbers. The number I have is a little bit out of date. So the number is indicative of kind of the size. And what really is the case is that, in general, still most of the amputations come from auto accidents. They come from farm accidents or industrial accidents. And so if you look at from the upper limb, ultimately. Now, there's about 1.6 million amputees in the US, but many of them are lower limb and diabetic. There's about 600,000 that are upper extremity, and only about 40,000 that are significant loss. So many are just simply digits or very small components of the hand. Also important, but not traumatic limb loss. And so really, if you look at 600,000, but most of them are down here, so 40,000 where you're basically from the wrist up in terms of people that have amputation. So it's not a market that typically gets as much attention as it has recently, but the progress has been pretty staggering to this point. So if you look what they started with, effectively, this was before the war. We made some advances beyond this, but this is the body-powered hook. Right? And even with myoelectrics, like I'm going to show you, a lot of people still preferred, in a lot of ways, the body-powered prosthesis because they were in control and they could feel what the hand was doing. Where myoelectrics, when you start to detach the motor from what you could feel, it became more of a foreign entity. So this, in some ways, was more attached to the individual or part of them than the myoelectrics become. And a hook is incredibly functional, actually. These anthropomorphic-looking hands often have pinkies that don't work, small fingers that get in the way more than anything else. And so sometimes you see these videos, people crank the hand all the way in a very an anatomical way so they can use the fingers if they're using myoelectric. So this has been very successful over time. This is more of the current, modern, marketed devices. Most subjects, most patients will have these devices, which are essentially, this is a 3-jaw chuck that you put a glove over, it looks like a hand, or the Greifer. And the reality is, the Greifer is probably used as much or more than anything else because this is very functional to grab small things on the table. The way that it works is basically opens in a linear way. You can be very functional with this. There's good vision, right? So using this, a lot of times the hand is actually in the way of what you're trying to get to, and the Greifer is very open. So this is, in fact, while it's not anthropomorphic, when it comes down to doing function, this becomes what a lot of people are using in many ways. The new things on the market, ultimately, or what is making its way out now, are the iLim Ultra, very anthropomorphic. The fingers have tendon-like actuation. They move, it can move independently. Bionic is another hand that does this. Again, anthropomorphic moving. And then ultimately Michelangelo, which is from Autobach, which is in regulatory hold up at the moment, so it's not on the market, but this is the advanced hand from Autobach that's moving forward. So they've worked a lot and made the advances in terms of what it looks like. There are much more realistic motions. I can tell you that you know, it's going to be interesting to see how these play out. There's been a lot of early on reliability issues that they've had to work out. I mean, you can basically, you know, one of our subjects had an limb, the earlier versions, and he said the first day he had it, he went out to dinner with his wife, went to pull open a door, and 4 of the tendons snapped, you know, in the inside of this limb. And so even though they look cool, and if you put it on and you show videos of it doing things, you're like, oh, that's awesome. You have to really look at what's happening on the function side. And you know, one of our subjects come in was using the B-Bionic, and it looks really cool, but there are some things about the functionality of the 3-jaw chuck and the way the fingers are designed to work on these that are almost more functional. So you have to be careful about how important is anthropomorphic look versus actual function. And so, but they're making progress, and I think they're, you know, this will be the hand of the near future. And then, of course, with all the investment from DARPA, fundamentally, there have been 2 main hands that have come up. And so this is the picture I found of it that I kind of like for the reason of shaking the hands here, which we'll talk about. But this is the APL arm, or MPL is the name of it. It came from Johns Hopkins in the APL lab. It was invested. And then this is the DICA arm for out of the efforts from Dean Kamen's group. And ultimately, this has been in clinical trials now at the Providence area with Linda Resnick. And so they're coming close to that, finishing that set of trials off with home use. I'm not going to get into the controls of them and how you, this has 23 degrees of freedom if you have the full arm, all the fingers and everything else. But ultimately it's a foot switch to control it. And so while control isn't ultimately what I'm talking about today, just be aware that the more complex the arm is, the control is an issue too. And so I'll spend a little time. It is the second most important issue. Bob just said it's the most important issue, but that's, I would say it's the second most important issue. Or equally first, let's say. So that's an area that we're working on and groups are working on. How do you control that many degrees of freedom? And I'll talk a little bit about a neural recording standpoint that Dominique has been doing. So it's very simplified, right? The idea is if we want to connect this, these are being developed elsewhere, right? This is being done. So we've got DARPA making advances and all that kind of stuff. But really, somehow we have to connect this back to the user, right? So what are the ways that we get either a command, which is where most of the work has been. There's been a lot of activity here in trying to figure out how to command this many degrees of freedom and do different things, and I'll introduce several of those. And then the interest is, how do I get sensation back? And so and I'll talk about what's been done and how we get there. But if I want a complete system, I want to try and get the hand into the nervous system, back up so the brain is in the loop. So we say control, but I think the reality is this is a command decoder, not a control system. We put the brain back in to be the control part of the loop with prosthetics in my mind. But we want to engage the actual biologic components in here. And so there are many ways that people have been doing this from the myoelectric standpoint. I'll just start here. You know, basically, this is what's current. It's basically a 3 electrode pickup that sits on the surface of the skin. There really isn't anything other than that at the moment today. And more or less, in the most commercial prostheses, there's 2 of them. There's one on the back and there's one on the front. So for these hands, you can open or you can close. Now with the more complex hands, the B-Bionic and stuff, there's still basically 2 pickups in the more available systems. Research is adding more. But what you do is you co-contract to change mode and then you run the hand. And in the hand, it's not so bad because I can control opening, closing switch, and I can use a different grasp maybe. But if I have an elbow, also a powered elbow, and I only have a couple degrees of freedom, I usually have to move one, then move another, move one, move another, and it becomes functionally very difficult. So there's a lot of work in trying to coordinate activity amongst these, adding more electrodes to get more command signals and stuff. One of the ways that's been done is, you know, Todd Kuiken and his group doing targeted muscle reinnervation, where they actually use the body as an amplifier and take what, you know, the nerve that was there that's maybe not connected to anything any longer because it's missing, and reconnect it to muscles that are available and use the muscle as the amplifier, right? So you take small neurological signals, amplify them with the muscle, and be able to record it. And so by putting the nerve into several different segments of muscle and then ultimately recording. So if I had the muscles that went down to my fingers, or the nerves that were my fingers are now attached to chest muscles that may not be connected to anything left, they start to contract. So you denervate with a normal innervation, and then you reconnect the median nerve, for example. And now a part of the muscle will fire when I'm thinking about moving my finger. So the natural thought of moving a finger causes part of the chest muscle, which is unnatural but different, to be picked up, which that electrode could say, you can pick that up. Okay? These are all external. The problems are you sweat. If you're in California, you put them on, they work great for the morning, and then by the time you start sweating, the socket moves a little bit, the signals change over the time, right? The interaction changes a lot. And so this is a big problem. Even this still the TMR system. So the advances here, and Bob, the reason he thinks command's the most important, but he's
the first thing you talked about.
I know, because I want to get the boring stuff out of the way. Not boring. To me. No, I'm just kidding. It's a very important part. But so now the thing is,
This guy controls the purse strings around here, you understand?
that's what. I actually like control now I think about it. So the idea is take them on the outside. We have years of expertise in spinal cord, and I don't have to say anything about what's going on here, but we can implant these electrodes. And so I haven't shown the case ones, and now I look at it, it's like, what the hell am I thinking? But ultimately, the ones that are in clinical trial now are the, it used to be the IMEs with Richard Weir, Greg Clark came on, sorry, Richard Weir, and ultimately the LIMEs now, which has been picked up in the Mann Foundation, and guess what? They attach a case lead to a bion capsule, and then so they can put the bions underneath the coil that sits in the socket of the arm, and then run the leads to the muscles they need. The other one, I think, the other area that's been around for a long time but making some progress recently is the osseointegration component. So in prosthetics, how you attach, a structure to a soft tissue, which was meant to be on the skeletal attachment, is tricky. And so part of the problems is always that socket that holds this on. And so Brandon Mark and different groups over in Europe have been working on direct bone attachment, and they're making progress on that. And obviously, no, not obviously, but the skin interface is a big deal. The nice thing about this is that lead can come right through the, you can put your leads and stuff through that post. And so there's groups working on that in Europe right now. So that's the essence of what I wanted to talk about on the control side. There's been a lot of progress. The reason I started with it is because there is progress on the control side. But what's still missing is this, the connection. It's still a tool because you don't have sensation yet in devices. And Ron Lundberg, who many of this area, especially the hand surgeons either listening or here will know, this guy has been in hands and in this area forever. He's a leader. And you wrote a book, The Hand and the Brain, recently. And ultimately his quote in the trailer says, the hand is a sensory organ, is as important as the eye or the ear. The sense of touch is essential for exploring the surrounding environment. You can read the rest. But essentially, the hand is what the sense of touch is what brings the hand to be part of who you are. It's an important aspect of being you. And so Paul Marasco, who, I don't know if he's here or not, but it's also here at Case, or at the VA and over at Cleveland Clinic actually, has done work with, someone, Todd Kuiken's worked with TMR, targeted muscle reinnervation. Sensory fibers would grow to the skin, and so you could touch the surface of the skin where it's been reinnervated, and you would get the feel of touching the hand. And so doing some of that, he was able to show that sense of touch really connected the user to the hand again in many different ways. And so sense of touch is what we're looking at, and I think that that's really an important thing. So let's talk a little bit about sensation and what it means here, and what is that we're after, what people have done. Why is it important? So I find this interesting. Actually, I was at a conference with Lee Miller and a group that showed this, and I've been using it since, from Johansson. If you look at on the left here, this is normal. This is figures. If you look on the left, it's a black screen. This will do the same thing, I bet. All right, I tried one of these earlier. Maybe these two videos don't work. What is to show there? I don't know how to switch it so it's all over on that machine, which usually takes care of this, so I apologize. On the left, though, the person, all they're doing is striking a match. So they can grab the small match from the matchbook, pick it up, strike the match, and you go. And it's a very short video because it doesn't take very long. All they've done on the right-hand side is put anesthesia, cutaneous anesthesia on there, so you can't feel your fingertips. And it takes a very long time. She can't grab the match. So fully functioning hand, there's no change in motor. So you can imagine the best prosthesis out there without sensation. And she can't grab the match. It takes a very long time. It falls out of her finger. She doesn't know how hard to hold it. She goes to strike it. The thing slides off. So there's a lot of challenges just by losing cutaneous afference. So the sense of touch changes very significantly what you're able to do functionally. So it's very important. So people have been looking at sensory substitution, so the idea of sensory feedback isn't particularly new. But a lot of what it's been is, again, how do we get sensory feedback to the surface? And so there is a fair amount of development. This is 2012, and people try to do these ideas of buzzers, electrical stim on the surface. So this is some design for different harmonic vibrators. that go on the skin, and depending on the pressure on the fingertips and the span of the hand, they vibrate with different frequencies and different intensities to try and give you a sense of where the finger and the hand is. And of course, they make a difference. But the problem is you have to sort of, it's not actually your hand you're feeling, so you have to feel a buzz and go, okay, that's the pressure. It's not, there's a bit of cognitive dissonance, if you will, there. So it adds to function because you can kind of tell what your hand is doing, but it takes a bit of burden mentally to do that. And so they haven't become very popular, though they do make a difference. 1970s, however, I think there was some work here, but also work published by Clippinger, Frank Clippinger at Duke. And this is the picture from the book. It's from the actual library. I couldn't get the electronic version of this thing. I had to go scan this. So as I know Professor Kirsch says all the time, the library still is a valuable resource. If you can't get it online, there's still valuable stuff elsewhere. But in the 70s, basically, he developed a nerve cuff electrode. And ultimately, he did this first. He put a cuff on a median nerve, turned on stimulation, and the person felt their hand. Right? So the difference between a buzzer up on the arm that you sort of have to guess what it is, he felt his hand. So the phantom, he felt it on that. And actually, I don't like the term phantom, so I'll try to refer to, if we're actually producing perception, if we're actually stimulating, we'll call it the perceptual hand. That's actually their hand. The phantom is different. They don't have control over it. They don't actually often associate it with them. They associate it as this sensation they have, and often it's painful, etc. So I'm going to try and distinguish, and I may slip, but ultimately a phantom hand is different than a perceptual hand. And so Clippinger initially showed this idea of the perceptual hand. And so he stimulated, and he had these in for up to 5 years. So he actually has the longest single channel implant that that's in published literature, and he did it both for the upper extremity and the lower extremity. So there is precedence for doing nerve stimulation for feedback. Now, what did he get is he basically stimulated the whole nerve. This was back in old cuff technology before people doing really cool new cuff stuff came along. But ultimately, this is back when single contact, you put it around the nerve and you would stimulate and the whole median nerve would go. And so what you would get is essentially the entire dermatome of the hand that was related to that you would get feel in. And the description of sensation was questionable, right? So what do you feel? Most of the time it's that paresthesia, or pins and needles, that tingling feel that you get when your hand wakes up, okay? And that actually will be a recurrent theme throughout that's, I think, very important to understand. So that was good. In the 1970s, they did this. Fairly impressive. More recently, back in 2004, Ken Horsch and his colleagues at Utah went back into this field. And so the idea on Clippinger was the fact that it's the whole thing, it's the whole hand, and I can't get any specificity. So what I need is a better interface to the nerve. And so he took his approach to the life. So these are the longitudinal interfascicular rays that go into the nerve and thread along, with the idea of being able to get individual sensors. Because there's a lot of literature that I'm not going to talk about that does microneurography that says if I stimulate one fiber, so unlike motor systems where if I stimulate one fiber, they probably don't get a functional twitch out of the muscle. I can stimulate, not me, but people that do microneurography can stimulate one fiber in a peripheral nerve and you can get a sensation. And how fast you stimulate the frequency can change the intensity of that sensation. And so sensory is very different, and we're going to see in a lot of ways different than motor, because what's happening is you're sending the signal back to higher circuitry in a lot of ways. So rather than a one twitch here goes to one muscle fiber or one motor unit firing and then trying to recruit more of them to get the size we need, you're actually going back into higher circuits. The brain is interpreting that input, and that's we're going to turn out to be incredibly important into what's happening. But what they were able to show quite nicely is that the question of plasticity, we always talk about it. If I'm a long-term amputee, does my brain completely reorganize and it doesn't really matter what I do in the arm, it's no longer associated with sensation. And what they showed, as long as 25 years post-amputation, they can still stimulate and get fairly localized sensation. So in fact, plasticity, all very interesting unto its own right, is not a brain necessarily reorganizing completely and no longer having the substrate from before. It's just the circuitry working itself to understand things differently depending on the input. So you can go back after 25 years and stimulate, and the person can still feel that finger that they haven't had for 25 years. So that was fairly important work early on, and they showed for the first time a degree of locality in what they're doing. All these trials, though, are for 2 weeks, right? So there's a limited time frame. They haven't been in for long term. More recently, the group in Europe has made progress as well. They've used a different electrode configuration, and they started to do, so this is what they call the time. So the Horsch group did the life. This is all acronyms, right? But it's the longitudinal. They thread along the fascicle. But you have one contact to an area of the nerve. what the group over there has been doing. Ken Yoshida initially came out of Ken Horsch's lab and changed this a little bit, and then now the Macera group and over there has been using this time. So it's transverse interfascicular electrode. And what they do is they go across the fascicles, and the idea is that they'll have multiple contacts along the length of the shank into the fascicle, and they can connect to different things. And so they've had electrodes in. This was a 2-week study, and they showed basically, again, interestingly, it was a fairly broad distribution of sensation they could get over that time. And within the 2 weeks, this electrode had lost sensation, or the stimulation had got to be too large, and so they actually didn't get sensation for very long term in this trial. More recently, as in like a month ago, February, in Science Translational Medicine, they published a new thing which sort of duplicated a lot of this work and ultimately showed again that they could get sensation, again, fairly dispersed, but they showed this out to about 4-week time. One of them was increasing threshold and the other one was fairly stable. And they used this for doing some control things in feedback. So they had somebody grab an object, and whether the object was short or long, the person could distinguish that based on whether they felt it in just the first 2 fingers or all 3 fingers. So they showed, again, some of the importance of sensory feedback in doing this, but ultimately this was only a 30-day trial as well, and they pulled them out. Max Ortiz-Catalan, again with the osseointegration, has used, in fact, a spiral electrode, came from RDM. So again, technology from Case, they put on the ulnar nerve in a subject that they've been implanted with an osseointegrated system with an implanted EMG now for over a year. So actually they have a very long osseointegrated connection system here, where he has an implanted EMG for control, which is actually quite impressive to see some of their videos. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. So it shows the value of implanted EMG and its stability. And normally when you have the surface electrodes moving the hand, sometimes can change what the control on that arm is. They have a guy reaching all over the place long term, doing very sophisticated things, and the controls rock on. So it's actually very nice to show intramuscular. And then he has a nice a bus basically goes through the osseointegrated post, and so you don't have to worry about percutaneous. Well, you have one percutaneous connection here, which is the problem. I mean, the challenge in a lot of these things. But they also put something on the ulnar and had very broad distribution of sensation. So again, he was able to show the nerve has sensation. There's a little more interesting work. Sleeman Benzemiah at University of Chicago has been looking at in monkeys. He's placed these in the cortex, Utah arrays, and some floating microarrays. And ultimately, it was able to, through behavioral studies on monkeys, show that they could distinguish individual points on the hand by stimulating in the cortex. So again, getting to the idea that they can get there. And the last one, Zelma Kiss up in Canada actually has been working in thalamic stimulation and been able to show, so published a paper, I think a year or two ago, ultimately that showed by stimulating, so they looked at how broad was the distribution. So this is the thalamus, right? Not even in the cortex and what she's doing. And it turned out that if small means basically the same thing we've been talking about, parts of the finger, a very good percentage, so macrostimulation being a broad area and micro being focused, if you microstimulate, about 55% of the stimulation was actually in a fairly small area. And defined a few things, but basically it was you get to a small area by thalamic stimulation, and you could get largely tingle. So I mentioned earlier the sensation that most of these have, now the non-human primates that we can't say, and the stuff that's been reported by Macera and these others is very vague, probably on this, but a lot of times they report sensation. The quality of it isn't as well laid out as to what they're doing, but tingle is probably a large part of it. Some mechanical sensation, a bit of movement, which is interesting, and then temperature, which I'd have to say we don't have. But the other graph that I find interesting is she reported, you can't read this, but I'll tell you what it is how natural the sensation felt. And that's a big deal, right? So most of the paresthesia is, and early on when we started our trial, I'll talk about it, they said it's an electrical feel, not natural. I mean, sensation was great. To feel something, they were like, I'll take that over nothing. But it was not natural. And she found the same thing with a very large proportion. Anything that's red is an unnatural or highly unnatural. Totally unnatural is the dark red, and then rather unnatural. Then possibly natural is this gray, and then almost natural and totally natural are these up here, and these are 6 different subjects. So for the most part, it's an unnatural feel in the stimulation. But progress, I mean, it's interesting to see there's all kinds of different places that you could stimulate and make this work. So I'm going to focus now where I spend my life is in the periphery, and we'll talk about the interfaces to get there. And so Doug Weber and Lee Miller put this out sort of as an overview last year as a paper. And basically, I like this figure because it tells you all the different places people are targeting sensory feedback. So we've talked about a couple up here. We've talked about a couple in the periphery. Doug works in the spinal, and that's obviously lower extremity too. But it goes everything from our cusp, which you're going to hear a lot about because that's the rest of my talk. The Utah arrays have been put in. There's been some short-term 2-week study now they've done with the Utah arrays. This is the time, or the transverse, the Macera group, what they've been doing. Arrays on the cortex, and then all the penetrating rays that you've heard in different things. And the other thing that they didn't put in their paper, but a group at University of Michigan has been working on are actually regeneration arrays and regeneration ideas where since it's already an amputation, you can actually go in there and maybe cut a little bit of that nerve and let the nerve grow back through an electrode. So they've been making some progress on that. But let's focus on what we're looking at. So we've done a lot of anatomy work that I'm not going to talk about. Natalie's writing a paper up that's going to actually quantify the human extremities from the wrist to the shoulder in terms of size, number of fascicles, all that kind of stuff. But this is a representation of a median nerve, actually probably a little bit further down. What we can see, and so those of you that do animal experiments have maybe looked at the histology and the cross sections of animals, there's probably 10 fascicles in the animal. There's about 30 to 40 here. So the numbers are much, much larger in the human. That's good, I think, for us on the extraneural standpoint because we can be fascicular selective. And so the idea of the electrodes has been that we want to maximize, the fine, which I'll show, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, what I've been doing, but ultimately the idea is if I can maximize the surface area, extend these fascicles into much as a linear arrangement as I could get them individually. And so we went into this wondering, can I get these individually? And if I could, what's the sensation I'm going to get? So just to set up the counter, we went into this trial saying, look, there's no sensory feedback at all. If I could just get a reliable interface that I can do long-term for the median nerve and get pressure on the whole dermatome, that would still be a success. It's better than nothing, right? And then we put one on the ulnar. If I could get the whole pressure on the dermatome of the ulnar, that would be a success. And then the radial, you get something back there. So the idea going into this was, I hope, right, that we can get specificity in where we are. But if I get the whole thing, or broad regions, it's still going to be successful, so it's worth going forward. And we had long-term trials, and so this is the approach. This is actually from, I didn't draw this, but we have some graphic artists in the FES Center that are doing a fantastic job putting some of this together. So this is the idea of the fine, is that we get it around, separate this into sort of a ribbon cable type of approach, and then multiple contacts on the surface that can allow us selectivity to each of these individual fascicles. And so that's the approach that we're taking. This electrode, however, we've been in people for up to 8 years now with spinal cord injury in both the upper extremity and lower extremity, and I think we're in the vicinity of 15 subjects now with electrodes that are long-term. And there's been no, I don't even think about the electrodes and I don't hear about them because they're just being used. So the interface is very stable, which justified, we think, going forward into the human model for sensory feedback. And then we also introduced at that time the fine for the first time in terms of sensory feedback. So that's where we are. So now the clinical study. So we get into what we've been doing. So that's the background, sets up what people are doing and where we're at, and hopefully the importance of sensation and what we are. So what have we done recently? So we have 2 subjects, and like I said, industrial accidents and things like that are most important. Our first subject, who's been the longest implanted, his injury was in 2010. And I'll refer to him as S102 in subsequent graphs and data. He was implanted in May 12, so he was about 2 years post. He had a forging hammer accident. And so he's a wrist dysartic, so very long. He's holding a pair of tongs, stuck it in there to grab something, doesn't really know what happened. All he knows is he woke up without a hand. Took it off, right? Clean at the wrist. Conversely, an interesting looking at the results in the common similarities and differences, our second subject was injured 9 years prior, so in 2004. And it was actually an industrial shredder, so it was a degloving accident. And so essentially shredded too much. He's basically a transradial, and he has about 3 inches below elbow that's left. And he was 9 years post. In the first one, we put 2 fines on the ulnar and the radial. We put a spiral on the ulnar and the median, and then we put a spiral on the radial, with the idea being, first one, we didn't really know. Let's put at least one electrode that's got some history in there and see what's happening. The results were, as you'll see, we thought spectacular, and so we have just actually put 3 fines in the next subject, and we haven't put the spirals back in. But you'll see the spiral actually performs quite well also. This gives you an idea of the surgery. Effectively, what we do is we mark out where all the cabling and everything is, trying to make sure that after the surgery we don't interfere with the EMG, right? So he's going to still use the same EMG control. I don't want to do an incision right under that and mess that up. These are marks for the edge of where his socket's sitting. These are marks for where the manual cable runs, because sometimes he has to actually go back to his body-powered device. We didn't want to have issues with where the leads were crossing and all that. So it's all pre-marked out. And then this is basically showing where the incisions are. The radial nerve is up here. We have the median nerve and the ulnar. And so electrodes in each one of those three. This took us maybe about 45 minutes to an hour to get to this point. Right? The rest of the surgery took longer, and part of the things we need to change. Because this is the x-ray, there are the three electrodes sitting on the nerve, this and this, which is the percutaneous connection, but this connector, the spring and pin, because now we're at 24 leads. Now this one has 20 leads, right? 16 fine and 4 spiral. So we got 20 spring and pins sitting in here. And by the time we finished the surgery, it's about 4 to 6 hours that we were at in the total time. So a lot of it took here and then this tunneling. In our second subject, we were implanted much higher. So this is important because everybody thinks that the nerve is very well organized. It's pretty well accepted that near the distal ends, the nerve is organized functionally and co-located with what's going on. But there's been a long-term sort of debate as to whether if I move further up the arm, if the axons are still co-located or somatotopically organized. Sunderland published a book and shows that there's, early on through a lot of cadaver work that the fascicles merge and diverge often. That's still true. But they made the assumption that because they converge and diverge, that all the things got hopelessly mixed. It was like shuffling a deck. I don't think that's actually the case. There's enough literature to the contrary. Now, but so these electrodes in our second subject, since he's short here, we don't want to be near the joints for concerns of the nerve, we're actually up in the forearm. That's quite proximal. And so the question was, are we going to have any selectivity up there as well? And then again, it's a little bit compact, but this was 24 leads. Again, the connection was a bit of a problem. So this shows you sort of the final after all of this. We are percutaneous, so we've had leads now for 2 years almost, percutaneous. The problems we have are pretty minor. They cover them when they're not in the lab, so we give them a bandage and some tegaderm, and they clean them every other day or so and call Melissa whenever anything looks funny. And the biggest thing we've had is a blocked sebaceous gland or something. They pop it, it's kind of like a pimple, clean it. We've been aggressive in giving them prophylaxis or giving them antibiotics. But we haven't, knock on wood, had any particular issues beyond that at this point. We kind of put the fear of God into people at this point. It says if that gets pulled, you're going to potentially have a problem, so they protect these quite a bit. So this has been very good. It's pretty clean. This is the incision where they go through, they put a lead field on both sides. And this is residing right in the upper arm outside the deltoid under his shirt sleeve. So when he comes in, if his shirt's rolled down, you don't even know he's got electrodes up there, and he goes on about normal. I want to point out this is the healed incisions you saw it earlier, but they're right under the socket. And so one of the concerns that we've had experience with the spiral in the spinal cord injured, but these are pretty much unmobile, relatively speaking, right? These are people that are in the seats. And so the question was, if you have an active person, this guy's out chopping wood, building decks, he's really active. He uses this thing all the time. He's lifting stuff. It comes in broke half the time because of how much he uses it. The question was, are the forces on these electrodes in normal use going to be disruptive to the nerve and things? We ask every time he comes in if he's felt unusual sensations. So if the cuff is being pushed, if it's impinging on the nerve, I would expect you'd feel something, there'd be pain, or there'd be some other evidence of this being pushed. Not once since the surgery even. Even after surgery in the recovery phase, there was no extraneous sensation that he felt in that perceptual hand unless we actually do the stimulation. So my takeaway on that is these cuff electrodes have been very stable and are not causing any sort of traumatic response in that nerve over this time. So we've been very excited about that. When it comes to the lab, we hook them up. We use the UECU and a desktop, all the system up here with the PC target, et cetera, to drive the stimulus that go into these electrodes. And then we basically have two phases. Because from other ways we know in other literature, that visual is very important to what you perceive. And so we wanted to just figure out what happens if I just stimulate this thing. I don't want to bias him with him looking at touching something or anything else. So we came in and we started, on day one, we said, just tell us what you feel. No arm on, just close his eyes, tell me what you feel. And this is one of those days in your career when you're like, this is awesome, right? So the first day he comes in, I'm thinking, whole area, just feel something, please. We turn on the first channel, he goes, that's my fingertip. Your finger? No, right here. Drew it on a sheet, it's dime-sized fingertip. Wow, that's cool, we got one. Okay, we went to the next one on the median nerve. There's 8 on here total. Okay, where do you feel that? That's my thumb. Cool. Another small area. By the time we finished, all 8 were unique. Every place was unique on this nerve as to where he felt. In fact, across 20, 19 were all in different places. That was great. It was well beyond what we expected. So we actually have localization by extraneural electrodes. When I went into this, I was told by a colleague that it's going to be a sand grinder on your arm all the time. It's not going to be so successful because you can't get enough interaction with the nerve. We still had the tingle. We'll get to that resolution later. But nonetheless, early on, we had localized sensation, and that was fantastic. And it turns out, so hold on a second, keep going. It turns out that the same thing happened. I'll show you the maps later. That the same thing is occurring also way up here. We get localized sensation. So we've been incredibly excited by the selectivity of what we can get. And so the reason we did the handshake thing, and it actually struck me even that day when we did this, they wanted to film something new, basically. But what happened is we've been working with him on the first 3 sensors, and I had typically when an amputee with the prosthesis, they'll just give you the prosthesis, but because they don't know how hard they're squeezing, they'll often not do. They get the wet fish, right? Is what I was told when I was young. They don't squeeze down. We put the sensors on the finger, now he could close and he knew when to stop and when he could actually give me some pressure to my hand to get that solid feel. And I was actually kind of shocked the difference it made, just to feel a grab as opposed to shaking something foreign on the end. But he said it that day when we do the stimulation on the ulnar side, so he knew he was touching my hand but didn't feel like we were grabbing his hand. When we turned the ulnar on, he could feel that pressure through the entire hand, so he felt you connecting back. And again, it's this sense of connection, right, that's important to what's going on. And then the confidence he mentioned, and we'll show you some of the results from stimulation. So sensory restitution, what do we get, or restoration? Here's the results. This shows the different places that we get with stimulation. So fingertips, which are nice, down in the thenar eminence. And what I want to point out is it's very important that you know how far apart your fingers are when you're doing a task. And so that was the bend sensor that you saw sitting on the top of the thumb there. We don't have proprioception on this subject at all because the electrodes are post where the muscles are, so you wouldn't expect that. So what we do is we feed in sort of a pressure, like if you were grabbing hard, you'd feel some tension in the thenar eminence. We give the sense of how far the hand is open or closed by giving him this pressure sense down on the thumb. I'll talk about proprioception when we get a little bit on this subject. And this is where, and again, remember, this is the electrodes up in the forearm. And these are the locations, the non-pink ones are what we get with single channel stimulation. And we've just started playing with a lot of combining channels, so field effects in the nerve. And in fact, we can get completely distinct and unique areas depending how we combine channels. So it's quite exciting that not only this is what we get simple, but we think there's a lot more in there to be grabbed even with these electrodes we have. Those are local, but if I want to get the whole hand, we can change the stimulation and that will spread. So it's not just localized, but I can actually get this to cover whole regions as well as I want. So the question might be, if I just felt these points, that would be weird. But if I want to, I can actually potentially get the whole region for more of a complete stimulation. So there's a lot of, we haven't got through all that. Now, we'll spend more time after the intermission, so to speak, on this. But I want to point out that this buzz, this tingle, actually pins and needle was the common description we had for about 6 months on these trials. Feels like a tingle, feels like a tingle. Drove us nuts. We tried all kinds of different things to get rid of tingle. We tried frequency that we use because we know that different sensors in the skin are responsive to different sort of vibrations, mechanical frequencies. It didn't help us. We tried changing the frequency in some pseudo-random order or some, basically pulsing at different orders. Nothing. We'll talk about more as the details, but we've been able to figure out, and it's in review, so I don't, this is the thing, but we figured out how, by changing different parameters in stimulation, by working at it differently, which we'll talk about in a bit, we can actually, he goes, one day I remember, the other aha day was we're in there and he's tingle, tingle. Oh, I feel my pulse. That's as natural as can be. So he said, it's just like putting my finger on my neck and feeling my pulse. That was a big deal. Because now he has pressure, distinct pressure. And in fact, by playing more, we ended up, he would say, I feel Velcro. Not tingle, Velcro. And we actually have a set of blocks of different textures, and he checked them all. Nope, this one, and it was Velcro. He says, okay, that's tapping. Somebody's tapping, not buzzing, just a tap on my hand. This is for vibration. The tuning fork, you feel vibration, different frequencies on there. Flutter. And we actually do get pain, actually, before sensation on one channel. So mostly we get all kinds of sensation without any pain issues. There is one that's pain first, so we can get pain. There's a value to pain, actually. And then light moving touch. And depending on glabrous skin versus hairy skin is what kind of sensations we get. But we got a whole plethora. And we get that in both subjects. They use different words for different things. And we started trying to nail that down. But the comments they make were as natural as can be. It's like taking my pulse and you're just pushing on my hand. It's like somebody laid a finger on my hand. So we go from this unnatural to natural, and we can vary the sensation. It was fairly crude. We're in the process of trying to understand exactly how to modulate so we can always, whenever we want on each one, give us a tapping and change these textures. So now I have location, and I have different texture at the same location. That's pretty awesome. Right? So we're getting control of sensation. All right, it's graded. So we would change, this case, pulse width, and then we ask them psychometrically, rate it on a 0 to 5, how much pressure you're feeling. We get a nice relationship. We also look at frequency underneath. So sensory information is encoding in frequency a lot of times. We had them, with their residual hand, push on a force sensor while we change the stimulation of the perceptual hand. And they would match the perception. And we get a nice, pretty linear relationship in terms of actual measured pressure to what the stimulation is. So it's graded. And I mentioned in our other subject, the 104, the second subject, he's up past where the motor branches are. In other words, you're getting the bag and chain. The fiber is typically responsible for proprioception. And proprioception is important for understanding where your hand is in space, not just pressure, but where it is. And we're starting to find a channel that as we stimulate, he goes, oh, my finger is moving. So he starts wiggling his finger. You can feel the finger wiggle. And we can go to an oscillatory thing. We've actually got to the point where we can just sort of move and hold his finger. And so we can, without getting into a lot of details, he's getting to, basically, by changing parameters, it can be here or down here. So we can get some proprioceptive information as well. So we're looking into that, which is good. Stability. We're 2 years. We're basically January till now, so that's what, 13 months, 15 months on one, and we're almost 2 years in May on the other. These are like several sessions in a row. They don't see the prior session. They just write the circles down where they are, and they put them on the map, and we just overlaid all of them. This is what they ran out to be on one, so very consistent over many, many weeks. This is the other one. This is the higher. This is 104. A little less punctate on some of them, but again, you're just getting very similar regions of where we're at. So it's a little more spread out. It is spread out, but it's still organized. Thresholds over an 8-week post-op period, all general nerve electrodes, they stay pretty stable percentage-wise. And even the charge threshold out now to well over a year has been stable or decreasing, meaning that the nerve is still responding. So we think we have the stability part. What's the functional side? First thing we did was we start to put on, do you know blinded? So we take away visual and auditory feedback. We say, can you tell me if you have an object in the hand? Intact, obviously 100% of the time he's right, so that's our control. And these are the two subjects, and it turns out it's surprising how close they are. If you give them no feedback, they're 50-50. They're at random chance as to whether they have a block in their hand or not. You turn on just pinch, that's the pressure. They improve, but they're still off a bit because they don't know if the hand's closed all the way and they're feeling the two fingers touch each other, or if it's touching the block. And so when we add this proprioceptive signal down here, they're able to distinguish whether they're touching the block or their fingers, and they go pretty close to 90%. So they can identify objects, which is fantastic. If this plays, I'll give you a little more detail. Pay attention on the left is no sensation, is on the right with sensation. Damn. All right, so my videos aren't working. No, it's not going. Is this just a phrase about doing the same thing twice? It's a Windows computer. All right, it's the format. Okay. Anyway, the point is, you saw it in the video. It's going to be more detailed, but he goes around, he explores, but when he moves his hand, he doesn't quite know where the block is at, and he goes to grab, and if he doesn't have sensation, it's just a blind guess as to whether there's something in the hand or not. And many times he would move off and carry nothing. So the other one, when he has sensation on, he can feel, a lot of times he'll close, no block, go back, no block, grab the block and go off. And so what we did is we measured that, and we looked at without any perception, so blinded, no pinch, and no pinch and no proprioception. There's 20 blocks, 10 blocks, right? 10 or 20, Dan? 10. 10 blocks on that platform. He's supposed to get them all off. He basically fails, he moves blank hand or he drops something at least 15 times. Then it moves down to this is where he's sighted and can look at his hand, so he knows he's missing. But with both proprioception, he only misses a few times, relatively speaking. So you can see the improvement in terms of number of failures and getting between 5 and 10 blocks off, he does better. This is the one that's interesting to me, is the failures. And again, you see in all of them moving down. So knowing he has it, knows whether to grab the blocks. So there's a functional gain. I doubt it. This will work too. This is the one that's, yeah. All right. So volume works, but not the picture. So in this case, this is the cherries idea. And so what we tried to do is ask what's hard to do. Right? So it turns out in prosthetics, unlike spinal cord injury, they have function. They use their hand. But what is the control component of it? So it's not just grabbing something, but it's grabbing it well, right, in control. And so with the cherry, the thing is, if you want to pull the stem off, you have to hold the cherry hard enough that it doesn't slip out of your hand, but not too hard to squish it. And that's what we're measuring, was we asked him to pull the cherry off while holding the fruit in the prosthetic. And it turns out with blinded and no sensation, he only gets 4 of every 10 without doing some damage to the cherry. That was what you saw in the video, squirting all over the place. And he doesn't know, and he feels very unconfident in it. When he's sighted, interestingly, only 75% accurate because you can't quite see what's happening and he actually would over grab on this. And then when we turn the sensation on and blinded, that's the blue one, he's already about 90% success. He knows when he's holding that. And when we turn it and he can see it, he's almost at 100% success. So sensation, here, even blinded with sensation was better than visual without. It tells you the importance of sensation there. More importantly, some real data, not just gee whiz cherry popping. If you look at this, here, this is the force he puts on the cherry while sighted, much higher than with sensation. No sensation with sensation. So control of the force is a much better approach. We did this some foam blocks to determine these are 3 different stiffnesses and 3 different sizes. The only thing I'll point out here is so we can start to determine which block and identify it. This is random chance for different sizes and hardnesses, and as we add sensory feedback, he gets better and better and more accurate in what he's doing. So again, identification is better. Last thing I'm going to say about the sensation sensory part here is ultimately phantom pain was a big deal. Both of the subjects had phantom pain coming in. The first one that lost his hand in the tongue said, my hand never changed from this position. It felt like a vice cramping down on this thing regularly. After the implant, so we do this pain questionnaire, the TAPES pain survey. 23 weeks out, is minor discomfort, not too bad. So this was a reduction. And now, for the last year plus, there's been no episodes of pain that is reported. So phantom pain is gone. Same thing with the second subject. He actually said at pre-implant, this thing was like jamming a nail through his thumb on some regular basis. That was the pain he experienced. He's had nothing since. Right. So having this implant is...
Is this phantom?
Phantom.
Okay.
Just they would feel it.
Nothing to do with the stimulation.
This was pre-stimulation. They had it post. They lost. They don't have it anymore. So we actually have been able to reduce and eliminate that phantom pain. They have no control over it. It's excruciating. Actually, it's debilitating. One of two is mentioned. Just he would have to not do anything for that day. Control of the phantom. The other thing here, again, I said to 102, his hand was like this. You turn on stimulation, he said, oh, he couldn't move that phantom. He couldn't even imagine it moving until when we turned stimulation on. Now he has control of his phantom finger. So when the sensory feedback's coming to the brain, he gains control of that hand again. And then the same thing, similar things have happened in 102. They feel it's like their hand again. They feel like I'm using my hand, and their confidence in what they're doing has gone way up. So sensation has made a difference for these guys, right? This is all in the lab only use. They come in every 2 weeks or something, or every month. They haven't gone home and seen their hand and had the sensation as part of the routine. They come in for a couple hours and they go home. I think when you take it home and use it, they're going to be better. And 102 made the comment, he says, when I leave the lab, I leave my hand behind, and I hate that. So it's interesting from that perspective. I'm going to go through quick through control, only just to say what we're doing, to show briefly. Grant McCollum's here, and Dominique, this is all his work largely. We have electrodes now that have many channels on them and then have been designed for recording, so extended a little bit. And all I want to point out is there's been a ton of issues they solved on noise. It's actually quite impressive. They're down to a less than half microvolt RMS type of noise. I mean, it's impressive, the noise level they got to. And they solved a lot of different problems, including capacitors that had sort of a noise aspect in it. The difference of materials of the leads, and we'll have to deal with this. So when you have silicon on PFA, it caused a noise that was significant within this, and they were able to get rid of that. The treadmill itself caused noise. So they've done a fantastic job of getting the stimulators working. Histologically, these long cuffs also behave well, so we think we can move this into probably clinical because they aren't causing an effect on the nerve. But importantly, they have interesting algorithms. So I'm going to go to the next one, which is actually more interesting. But now they get neural recordings from extraneural cuffs, and using a series of algorithms where they take all of the information from the channels, and hopefully this one works. If not, I'll tell you what's happening. All right, this one's cool. So by using this in real time while they recorded the data, this is sort of what you get during the plantar flexion phase, and then we move on to dorsiflexion, the signal sends to move. So now within this common nerve, it's in the sciatic of the dog, they're able to determine whether the dog is walking, plantar flexing or dorsiflexing in terms of what's going on in the muscles. So making good progress, they're making great progress, and have Dominique back later, in doing the recording. I think we're actually making a viable approach at the nerve interface for recording. So that's the end of the part one piece. I'm going to stop and just hopefully, we're at that time frame. Basically, stable chronic interface for sensor restoration, spatially localized, multiple quality of sensation, functionally and psychologically a benefit, and we get viable nerve recordings. Second part that I'm going to go quick, for anybody who wants to stay after we do questions, is I want to talk about how the physiology, because I think it's very interesting and has impact well beyond sensation I want to talk about. But.
So Dustin, do you have any experience in learning?
Hunter, I don't.
Do your subjects have any, You've changed their performance over time as a result of...
Yeah, so that's a great question. Formally, no. That's why the take-home was we want to study that more formally. What we've noticed is when we started early on, they would come regularly. Our first subject would come regularly every week. Now we've backed off to every other week or every third week. When he'd come in, after a couple of days or a couple of weeks of experiment, this place would pop to the same place right away. Now we've extended, it takes a little bit, he comes in, it still resolves, but it takes a little bit more to get back at it. So I think that there is a learning component. We haven't studied it. There's a lot of other things we've been doing I want to take the time on, but I think it's going to happen for sure. And not only that, the sensation we'll talk about in a minute, I think will also resolve to more distinct on the patterns and what they're looking at and stuff. So I think it's a big issue, but we've got to get home use is the next step for doing that. I think I saw a render, then I'll go to Rudy. Yeah.
Over the course of the years that people have been funding, when they go home over the course of the year, has there been a change in their sense of when they're not being stimulated, when they're using their hand?
They don't report it. The only thing that changes is sort of where, like for example, on our short transradial, his hand used to be, the fingers were typically right at the end of the stub, or end of the residual. Now they're out towards where the hand is. So the perception of where the hand is has become more natural. So, but
you all have some degree of telesensation, right? Like when you use the spoon and find that there's sugar at the bottom of the coffee. That's coming through the spoon into
Right.
your hand. Does that something like that happen?
well, they have. I mean, so they have feedback through the prosthesis, right? They can tell what they're doing because they hear the motors. I mean, that's why we take away visual and audio feedback when they're using the thing.
Has that changed over the years?
They haven't reported it. We haven't studied, so I can't say yes or no to that. There's nothing to indicate that it has, other than maybe where they perceive the hand. But we haven't asked any specific to give you a good answer on that.
Can you envision providing them a sensation of temperature, shape of the object, and texture of this object?
So texture, I think so, and I'll talk more about that in a second if anyone wants to hang here. I think so. We have evidence of texture. We have some other experiments we're starting with the University of Chicago and Sleeman, actually, where we're putting in a little more, based on what the model of the nerve should be doing. We're doing some modeling to stimulate that, and we're actually getting different texture. So I think yes on texture. The idea of temperature is going to be tricky because those are small fibers. We have no evidence of temperature that I would stick on right now. And then the other one is object shape. That's a multiple sensor type of thing. And so what's going to happen there is we begin to use all of the channels in a coordinated fashion. We'll answer that, and that's part of Emily's work. So I don't know yet, but I suspect yes. Because if it's moving across your hand, the sensation moves, or if you have this one off and these on, these type of things. Just like the handshake. Felt very different to him because he had both sensors on, or all the sensors. So I think yes, but we don't know yet. We haven't done the studies.
Have you done any sensory discordance evaluation, like put these sensors on the griefer hook and see how does that affect?
We've talked to him. We're looking at doing that. We haven't done it yet. At first, when we asked the subject, would you want sensors on your greifer? He said no. I think that's sort of changed. We'll see. We haven't done the study yet to see if it really matters or not. But there was a concern, it's like, well, it's not my hand. That would feel weird. So we don't know.
The appearance of phantom pain a permanent thing, or is body still weak?
It hasn't come back. I mean, it's not because, I mean, I don't know if it's because we're stimulating because of surgery or whatever, but it's not like we're stimulating all the time. It's just they don't have it anymore since they got the feedback.
You mean the phantom pain or the perceptual one?
The phantom pain. They don't report any pain interim, and we don't stimulate at home. So what it is, we're not sure. But
Subject reports being blinded, so wood from plastic. Do you know how they're doing that?
the foam block study, basically where they could tell where they're at, how much pressure they're putting as the hand closes to different degrees, I think was how they're able to. They were told two things. One is tennis ball versus something else. I think it's compliance. They're able to tell how hard they're pressing for a given motion. The other thing was they took like a tennis ball versus a rod. Well, that was whether this sensor was active or just these two. So they could tell shape because of the interaction between them. But they showed that they could detect different compliances of the objects, which is, I think, how they could tell the different things. Not texture, but actual compliance.
Are there any tests you do prior to surgery that gives you an idea whether or not they'll have any success?
So having some phantom, there's a Tinel's test. You can tap, or we push on where the nerve is and see whether they get sensation. So we do check for viability of sensation. Interestingly, based on what we've been doing in spinal cord, we did some somatosensory evoked potentials in the surgery. Fortunately, we ignored them a little bit because we didn't get them. So I don't know why, and it's an interesting question that's been left out there, but we did somatosensory evoked potential in surgery. On the intact limb, we got good clear signals. On the other one, even if we stimulated the nerve directly, couldn't find it. We had to turn the current way up. In fact, high. So we're like, popped out, our thresholds are great. So for some reason, the somatosensory evoked did not work in the amputated side. So we've discounted that now. We don't actually use that as an intraoperative measure for the cuff, which is very interesting. But we do look ahead of time at Tinel's and a few other measures.
Did you repeat that on the second subject?
I don't think we did. I think we just timed because the surgery's already 6 hours and we said we can cut that. It wasn't going to change our decision on what we did. It's a good question, and it's still an interesting thing to me as why, but I don't know.